And if I can just get started now, and to warmly welcome Dr. Kate Phillips for coming all the way to Grahamstown, or Makanda, to launch the book of Markets on the Margins, Mineworkers, Job Creation and Enterprise Development. There we go. Absolutely beautiful. Just a few words on Dr. Kate Phillips. She has extensive experience in the development sector, both as a practitioner as well as in development of policy. And she's focused on issues such as economic marginalization, inequality, employment, and enterprise development. As the book indicates, much of her work on development is rooted in the trade union movement. And she spent many years actually working for the National Union of Mineworkers project on job creation. The project on job creation for NUM. She's a development strategist, and she's done a lot of work, firstly in providing support for entities such as the National Treasury. She's also worked with economies of Regions Learning Network, and she's also provided support to the South African presidency, and played a central role in the design and development of South Africa's community work program. She's not just involved in the South African context, but she's also involved with the International Labour Organization, and she's currently supporting the government of Greece in relation to its public employment program, and she teaches courses on public employment for the ILO interim. So thank you very much for coming through.
Thanks so much, and thank you to all of you for coming. It's a real pleasure to be here. The story starts a long time ago, and when I've been giving these seminars, I look around the room and I realize that actually quite a few of you weren't born when the story began. But the story began in 1987. There was a mine workers' strike. It was, in fact, still is the biggest industrial strike the country has had. It was at the height of apartheid oppression. The National Union of Mineworkers was only 5 years old. It was a young baby union, but it had already become the biggest union in the country. And the strike was not so much a strike as actually more of an industrial war. There were tanks, there were guns. Which mining company is it? Not De Beers. Goldfields had patented their own rubber bullets. 11 mine workers were killed in the strike. Over 500 were injured. It was a really violent strike. And at the end of the strike, 40,000 mine workers were dismissed. And at that point, NUM took a decision to set up a job creation unit, because those mine workers were then dispersed across southern Africa, back to the Bantustans and back to what were then called the frontline states. And they had no chance of coming back and getting work in white South Africa or on the mines again. And so NUM took a decision to set up a job creation unit, which is an unusual role for a trade union to play. It was unusual then, and it's unusual still. And yes, it was Ramaphosa who was General Secretary at the time. The idea was to start with worker co-ops, and we had great hopes that we would transform or create an alternative to the conventional firm through co-ops. What the book covers is phases of development over a 14-year period. It started with co-ops, and I'll go through each of about 4 different phases of implementation, review, strategic rethink, trying again, doing better, but still finding problems, trying again. And I think that's the essence of the book, is talking about the gritty realities of implementation, the gritty realities of applied development work. And that's, for me, the reason I came back to write the book about this period so long ago, is that I keep seeing the same mistakes being made in the development sector. People don't need to repeat the mistakes that we made. We did it. We did it for you all. So part of the purpose of the book is to document all of that and to talk about what went right, but what went wrong. So the focus today is on some provocations related to what works and what doesn't work in the development context. So let's start with NUM's co-op strategy. There were lessons from success as well as lessons from failure. We set up 30 cooperatives, worker cooperatives, across southern Africa, Transkei, Lesotho, Swaziland. Quite a few failed, but some lasted for more than a decade, which even today is not bad going for co-ops. There's quite a lot of idealism around the role that co-ops can play. And I certainly started off at the beginning of this process with a lot of that. But the process of co-op development came up against some really difficult challenges, and I'm going to highlight what those were. I think one of the key things that we learned early on is that we were trying to create jobs. 40,000 mine workers had been dismissed. We wanted to create jobs at scale. The problem is that the number of jobs that a co-op can create is determined by their market share. Now, most workers in the co-ops assumed that the number of jobs that could be created would be determined by how much they produced. That's not the whole story at all. Of course you've got to produce, but if you can't sell what you produce, you can't pay wages. And time after time, that was the problem. Not access to finance, not ability to produce, not quality of product, access to markets, how much you can sell. No sales, no income. No income, no wages. Plus, it's not actually that easy to create jobs through enterprise development. I can give you the exact sums if you want them, but essentially a co-op of 20 women who want to earn a meager 1,000 rand a month each, that typically requires sales of 250 dresses a month. If you're selling the dresses at about 100 and 150 rand each. That is very hard to achieve in marginal economic areas. 250 dresses a month. And if you can't sell that much, then you can't employ 20 women. And that was the problem that we found ourselves confronted with. Because of the crisis of job creation, many co-ops take on more people than the economic base of the co-op can actually support. We certainly did that. What that leads to is self-exploitation and co-op failure. So, for example, the first co-ops we set up was 2 block projects in the old Transkei, in Flagstaff and Umtata. The feasibility study showed that each co-op could absorb only 20 people. In the face of the 40,000 who'd been dismissed, that was pathetic. The figures were bumped up to 60, which was still pathetic. But in the process, the viability of those co-ops was destroyed. Meager wages that could be paid for 20 people now had to be split between 60 people. But this is a classic problem in the South African context. Co-op after co-op is said, who wants to be in the co-op? No attention paid to the economic base of the co-op. Okay, but what I want to highlight is, so, the net effect of all of that is that if the purpose of the co-op is job creation, in fact, worker co-ops have been an unwieldy instrument with which to achieve it. But what I want to focus on here is some of the wider set of strategic choices in relation to co-ops, because much of the focus in the South African context, for obvious reasons, has been on co-ops as a vehicle for employment creation. But in fact, there are many different kinds of co-ops, and these different kinds of co-ops have different strengths and weaknesses. This is an incomplete typology, but worker co-ops are worker-owned. They're democratically managed. All the workers are members, all the members are workers. The purpose is job creation, democracy and production, it's an alternative to the conventional firm, and it's the main source of livelihood for members. They work full-time in the co-op and they rely on it for their livelihood. By contrast, user co-ops, like consumer co-ops, they are owned by the users. So if it's a creche, it's owned by the parents. If it's a consumer co-op, it's owned by the consumers. The consumers elect a board. If it might start as a buying group, it might get bigger. In Italy, consumer co-ops look like Woolworths. They're owned by the consumers and they employ staff. They employ workers. Those workers don't control the co-op. They may be members. They may also be consumers, and in that capacity they may be members. There's some hybrid structures. But in general, a consumer co-op model or a user co-op model is not worker-owned, it's user-owned. It's a different model and it has different consequences. The purpose is cheaper goods for the consumers. And it's not their main livelihood. They may save some money by doing, collective buying, but they're doing other things in the day. It's not their main livelihood, and that changes the character of the entity. The third kind is producer co-ops, like farmers' co-ops, where all the members are producers. So each of the members is a farmer. They have their own farm. They employ people on conventional terms. But they come together to create economies of scale through a collective mechanism. Now, each of these types of co-op differs in complexity, in forms of management, impacts on members, and also their relationship to markets. The title of my book is Markets on the Margins, and this is going to be a theme. So, in terms of... I went backwards and so forth. So, worker co-ops. They're seen as the most progressive, as the kind of most socialist of the co-ops, okay? But the number of members they can absorb is constrained by market share. They are typically at the receiving end of market competition. They are market takers. They're not market makers. They are at the mercy of competition with other co-ops, other firms. User co-ops, by contrast, while worker co-ops, the number of members is constrained. In a user co-op, the more the better. The more members there are, the more the economies of scale. And so it's user co-ops that tend to go to scale. So, in Italy, there are many consumer co-ops, but one, the Coop Italia Societe Cooperativa, is the largest retail chain in Italy. It has 7.4 million members. Compare that to our little 20-person block projects. It has 7.4 million members. It employs 56,000 employees. Now, Italy has one of the strongest co-op movements in the world, including its worker co-ops. They saved 9,000 jobs during the financial crisis. And that's a lot of jobs, and there are a lot of jobs in the worker co-ops, but they pale into insignificance compared to the number of jobs in the consumer co-ops, which are not set up to create jobs. It's not their purpose, but they create far more. Similarly, producer co-ops in India, 76,000 village-level co-op associations and over 11 million members of self-employed producers. The reality is that in other parts of the world, co-op movements have gone to scale through these two forms of co-op. And they've also created the most jobs through these two forms of co-op. In South Africa, because our priority is job creation, we've prioritized this form of co-op, which is the hardest, succeeds the least, and creates the least jobs. There's the irony. The other key take-home I want to give you is the consumer co-ops in Italy. They are market shapers. They took a decision not to sell fridges without a certain lower level of CFCs than was the market norm at the time. They changed the face of fridge manufacturing in Italy. Similarly, they decided that they would only accept more organic vegetables, change the face of Italian agriculture. They've got market power. These co-ops, I'm afraid, they don't have market power. They're market takers. These ones are market shapers. And so if we're looking at the issue of markets and how we might want to shape them, and if we're looking at trying to build a co-op movement, we need to understand the different roles of different types of co-ops within that process. I keep going backwards, sorry. So, after 7 years, we had 30 co-ops, about 20 members each. That's 600 jobs. It's a lot of co-ops. It's a lot of work. We had a big team. We had agriculturalists. We had people with MBAs. We had offices in 4 parts of Southern Africa. It was a big show. And what did we produce? 600 jobs. It was pathetic. And we had to step back and say, this strategy can't go to scale. If we're serious about creating jobs, we need to do something else. And what emerged from that was a critique of approaches focused on setting up projects. Now, it's not just co-ops that are projects, but we are not going to change the world one project at a time. We're not going to create enough jobs to deal with our crisis one co-op at a time. how do we move to strategies that are able to reach greater scale? That was the challenge the union leadership put to us. In fact, the president of NUM at the time, Dan Kafatsi, said, I'm not going to talk to you again until you come up with a solution, and he didn't talk to me for about a year. We did come up with, not a solution, but we came up with a different strategy. So the issue the penny that dropped for us is that project approaches can't scale. Then we needed scale. Now we need scale. So what to do about it? Looking at it, we ended up with a critique of, I've forgotten her name, anyway, it's in there, who coined the term the projectizing of poverty. And she critiques the projectizing of poverty, this idea of, and it lends itself to ribbon cutting, this idea of setting up projects and leaving the systemic issues on one side. The thing about projects is that all development interventions, if they succeed, they will have distributional impacts. Otherwise, why are you doing it? You're trying to improve the lives of some people. That's a distributional impact. It also impacts on power dynamics at the local level. Who benefits? Power dynamics over the distribution of benefits and of ownership, including of political ownership. Who gets to claim it if it's a success? Who gets to not claim it if it's a failure? This applies particularly at a project level where resources are brought into a resource-starved community. And it doesn't matter how inclusive the consultative process might be in one village, the village over the hill can feel excluded. Tensions are heightened when projects try to solve these problems by targeting the poorest of the poor. People don't always want to be outed as the poorest of the poor in their community. It's not necessarily a way of conferring dignity, for example. But the more that projects take place in a zero-sum context, in which some people in the community benefit a lot and other people don't benefit at all, the more you have a recipe for conflict. And the reality is not helped when you try to mitigate that by promising the community that the community at large will benefit in some way, at some point, through some undefined mechanism. That's also a recipe for conflict. And finally, the focus on projects detracts from more systemic issues. So, yet projects are still often the focus of development intervention, and the recent Jobs Summit is a case in point. So what are the alternatives? Well, we started to look at alternatives. And we looked at a shift from providing projects that just benefited the participants to providing services that were open to all on a self-selected basis. We set up 8 development centres across southern Africa. A feature of all of them were business supply stores, addressing what we identified as a market failure. If you're going to produce T-shirts, printed T-shirts with slogans, where do you get the inks? If you're going to make leather belts, where do you buy the buckles? If you're going to make yogurt, where do you get the foil caps? You get it in the big towns. In marginal areas, which is where we were working, you can't buy those kinds of business input supplies. That acts as a significant constraint on enterprise development, and it acts as a significant cost. We had, groups of women traveling from Maseru to Sasolburg to buy wax for candles. We didn't have electricity every day at a time. Now we don't again. But so business supply stores were a key part, and the idea was that they would start and build a market and become sustainable, be able to cover their costs over time. So that was a key. That was a key thing. Another feature of the business supply centres was equipment hire. So there were about 20 different production stations in these centres where people could come and hire the equipment. What that meant is it reduced significant cost and risk of starting a business. So people would come, this is in Klerksdorp, they're hiring the baking facilities. They're baking a batch of bread, they'll sell it. If they can't sell them all, well, they know they can't sell that many. If they could sell more, they can come back and make more the next time. So by hiring equipment, it created a safe space, if you like, for business experimentation. This is a list of some of the kinds of things that happened at the centres. fence making, flour milling, oil production, key cutting, leather goods, milk bottling, t-shirt printing, blah, blah, blah. But there were a whole lot of different... What was identified was that there was a real lack of diversity in terms of local enterprise activity, and the centres were promoting what we termed local production for local consumption. So people making and producing the things that people around them use and need in their everyday life, and circulating money in the local economy. It's a pretty classic development theory model of development intervention. So, there were some good outcomes. A brilliant one was that users were now self-selected. No more choosing beneficiaries. Dreadful process. Anybody who wanted to use the centre was welcome. They could be an ex-miner, they could be a member of the community, didn't matter. Open to all, the more users the better. There were cluster effects, there were demonstration effects, people would come and watch other people doing things. There was an exponential increase in our outreach and scale. There were good outcomes in the local economy. There were challenges of cost recovery, but that's another debate which you can read about in chapter 9 and 10. But then we came. So the centres, we were happy with the centres, but then we did a very detailed impact evaluation of the enterprises that were being supported. What did we find? Firstly, what is very interesting is the gender profile, and look at the Eastern Cape. Now this is NUM. This is the Union of Mineworkers. And the vast majority of the people benefiting from the program were women, and NUM loved that. It was not a problem. Now look at the income returns of the participant. Okay, so this was like in the 1990s. But even if you index this to inflation, naught indexed to inflation is still naught. Okay? This was horrifying. 33% of people were earning nothing from their enterprise activities. The earnings were appallingly low. We were devastated.
What type of earnings are those? Monthly?
These are monthly. Also interesting is the contrast between individual entrepreneurs in the grey and group projects. So the group projects do much worse than the individuals, which was also not something we necessarily wanted to find, but I think when it stares you in the face, it's actually something you have to deal with. So, why were the returns to enterprises so low? This was supposed to be creating jobs. This was supposed to be giving people livelihoods. This is the small enterprise development strategy that's going to save our economy. Yeah? Look at those returns. They were appalling. Why? We did a lot of soul searching. And what we ended up coming to was lifting our gaze from the villages we were working in and recognizing that the economic activity was taking place in the shadow of the highly concentrated and equal structure of the South African economy. This is the consumption basket of a poor household. You tell me what's in that basket. What's in the basket? Someone? What's in the basket? There's meal. There's meal. What else? Beans.
Cooking oil.
Cooking oil. What else is in the basket?
Salt.
Salt. Yeah. Sugar. Tea. Maybe a beer or two sometimes. What else? Okay, this is the consumption basket of a poor household. This is actually what you're likely to find in that consumption basket. All of the things you mentioned and a few others as well. So bread, milk and dairy products, flour, peanut butter, margarine, fruit juice, poultry products, canned goods, potato chips, rice. And you recognize what's in red? Okay? These are all monopoly companies. These are all large corporates in our core economy. The fact of the matter is, every single item, and I challenge you to find a manufactured item. Fresh produce is a different story, but I challenge you to find a manufactured item in the consumption basket of poor people that is not mass produced in our core economy. You won't. I know you won't. Because there are none. This is the nature of the South African economy, and it's different from other developing countries. Why? Because we had sanctions and we had foreign exchange controls, and the mining companies couldn't take their capital out, and so they reinvested. And what did they invest in? Maize meal, bread, sugar, flour. Those are all owned by Anglo-American in 1994. That's what happened, and that's different from Tanzania, and it's different from India. And conventional development theory doesn't help us in this context, because in Tanzania, you can make peanut butter and sell it. And I think today you probably are competing with Black Cat and Yum Yum, but certainly then you weren't. But in South Africa, you just can't do it. In the most remote areas. So I'm sure you know, what's his name, the fortune at the bottom of the pyramid, Prior. So one of his examples is about how there's money to be made from bulk breaking and selling little sachets of Lever Brothers products, and how it's a win-win for everybody. We are the counterfactual. Lever Brothers, that's a Lever Brothers product. Lever Brothers has products targeted at women who are still washing in buckets in the river. Okay? So, these markets are sewn up. And that has really important implications for development strategy. Poor people buy a limited basket. They fill that basket, but not much more. Okay? They're mass-produced in the core economy at a scale that makes it impossible for small producers to compete on price or on brand recognition. And particularly post-94, brand recognition was a big thing. It was about a better life for all. It became, people wanted brands. They wanted branded products. Branded goods also provide quality assurance. Even for things like furniture. Craftsmen or women might make beautiful wooden furniture, but if they can't provide higher purchase terms, they can't compete with the big retail outlets. Advertising impacts on aspirations. So, the takeout here is small-scale producers have to compete in relation to price, quality, brand recognition, and financing terms. It's very hard. Actually, it's often impossible. And yet, development strategies continue to promote this. Enterprise development strategies continue to set the poor up for failure, because that's what this does. And we did it ourselves. No one else needs to. We figured it out. So, what does that mean for strategy? It was back to the drawing board. Tear our hair out. Oh my God. Now what are we going to do? So, we know what doesn't work. What doesn't work is this lovely concept. So, co-ops were a lovely concept and they didn't work so well. Local production for local consumption, targeting poor consumers and communities with meeting their needs. It was a lovely concept, and it didn't work. It doesn't work where you're targeting poor consumers in ways that cannot compete on price with the monopoly sector. Okay? It won't work. Or on brand recognition, or on payment terms. So what are the alternatives? Actually, there really are some. Once you put your mind to it, and once you understand what the problem is. Firstly, what if you produce products that are not already made in the monopoly sector? I mean, they can't be doing everything. Okay? What if you differentiate those products in key ways? Or focus on services? The irony is that in marginal areas, people need a photostat copy where they are. The fact that they can get it cheaper in East London doesn't help you if you're in a city. Okay? So there is a margin for services that is locational. They're non-tradable. There are actually opportunities in relation to services. What if you target consumers with more disposable income? We're the most unequal country in the world. There are some people who have money. What if we target them and try and get those incomes into poor communities, rather than just circulating the money of the poor in the same community? What about external markets? We don't just have to sell to people next door. What if we start trying to target markets in Johannesburg and London and wherever else? Maybe East London is a more realistic option. So, that's what we decided to try to do. And just some examples before we get there. So, Sowetans like their chicken fresh and local. To this day, the monopoly sector has not cottoned on to the value of a live chicken. We have more refrigeration now than we had then, but live chickens still sell well and at a very good price in most townships in the country. It's an area that has not been monopolized by the monopolies. Smileys are not yet on the menu at McDonald's. There is a market for them. I love this one. You know this one? Kailicha Coffee? Kailicha Department of Coffee. They set up a barista station at Kailicha Station. Now, 20 years ago, I don't think you could have sold an espresso or latte or cappuccino at Kailicha Station. But today you can. And they're doing a thriving trade. There is income variation, there is differentiation within communities. There is increasing inequality, not always a good thing, but, not everybody is poor. There are people with disposable incomes. Those are what need to get tapped. So where to go? That's another story, because it got bought out by Heineken. But it did start. A brewer who earned his stripes in SAB, set up his own business, couldn't get money from the DFIs, the development finance institutions, but managed to set up Soweto Gold as a craft beer. But the story is he did get bought out by Heineken, a global monopoly. So is that a good story? Is that a bad story? That's a discussion for another day. So the question we posed ourselves was, what might it look like if we targeted external markets? Forget the local production for local consumption, lovely thing. What if we start targeting external markets? What does it look like? What does it mean? What new challenges will it confront? And now a little bit of theory. I never thought that I would discover that Adam Smith had some very sensible things to say. I grew up with good Marxist theory and thought Adam Smith was the bad guy. Now, what I didn't realize was that Adam Smith was writing at the point of the, what's it called? The commercial, before the Industrial Revolution. He actually wrote before the Industrial Revolution, and what was actually happening in his day was the shift from local production to local consumption models to globalization, to targeting external markets, and it was introducing new sets of problems. And to my great surprise, I found that he had some very sensible and clever things to say about the implications of that. Contracting face-to-face, what you see is what you get. It enables informality. Okay? You don't need a contract. If I'm selling you a banana, we don't need a contract. As soon as we are selling across distance with people you don't know, met you before, but I haven't met you. Have I met you before? I don't know you, but you want to order bananas from me. What size? What quality? What happens if they're rotten when they get there? What recourse do I have? Do I trust you enough? I've never met you. As soon as you contract across distance, it's called anonymous exchange. An anonymous exchange, it turns out, is the basis of the development of contract law and the institutionalization of markets. When you're transacting me and you, what you see is what you get. You don't like it, you don't buy it, you pay for it. It's your risk. As soon as you're contracting across distance, you need contract enforcement. And for me, even more interesting here, in terms of debates about informality, is that Douglas North, who is, I won't call him a lefty, but he's certainly a bit more, not quite in the same kind of category as Adam Smith. The point is, Douglas North argues that the risk premium associated with transacting across distance determines whether or not that happens. And if it doesn't happen, growth can't happen. Think about it. If your only economic activity is I'm getting what I need and I'm selling you what you need, but we're doing it all in the village, there's not a lot of scope for growth because there's only so many needs in the village. Growth comes when you start selling to the next village and the next village and the next village, then your village grows. Okay? So the point here is that as soon as you're transacting across distance, as soon as you are targeting external markets, formality enters the picture. You cannot transact across distance informally. That's a face-to-face thing. So the face-to-face thing is actually a constraint on growth, but if you want to access the benefits of external markets, you actually have to formalize. And that was one of the first things we learned. If you are in external markets, you are in a value chain. You are doing business-to-business transactions because you are selling to a retailer. You may be in a longer value chain, but at very least you're selling to a retailer. It's a business-to-business transaction. Business-to-business transactions are formal. So we had to get our heads around. We've been operating in the space of informality. All the enterprises we were supporting were effectively informal, local, informal enterprises. So what we initiated, and I'll end off with the lessons from this, we initiated the commercialization of the indigenous marula fruit. Any of you know marula? Okay. So, it's a prolific indigenous product. It's never been colonized. It's never been commercialized. It only grows on communal lands. We worked, Mineworkers Development Agency, we worked with the CSIR, we developed technology which stabilized the juice for the very first time. That berry ferments as it drops to the ground. And nobody had ever managed to stabilize it as a juice, and we did. To cut a long story short, we ended up with 2 value chains built from the bottom up. 4,000 women in 42 villages, earned incomes paid through bank accounts. There were 2 value chains. The one was the juice, and that ended up in a product called Marula Mania, which Ceres produced. Do you know Ceres? Okay, so Ceres produced a product called Marula Mania. Every single marula in that product came from this program. The other value chain was oil. Marula oil has an incredibly high value as an oil. Today, it is the base oil in every Body Shop makeup product. Any of you wearing Body Shop makeup? If you are, marula oil is the base oil in all marula, in all Body Shop products. So these were 2 really exciting value chains that were developed. So, what problems did we encounter? There were many, and you'll have to read the book to get them all, but I'm just going to pull out one. Here's the problem. No buyer will invest in the significant costs of product development of a new product and innovation if they don't have a secure source of supply for the raw material. Okay? So if they're going to invest in product development, which is an expensive process, they need to know that if they decide to go into production, there will be a source of supply. But if there isn't any demand, how can there be supply? That's the problem. How did we overcome that? We were lucky. And clever. A local juice pulper, Bronpro, because this Mala Centre and this project was in the middle of the Tulamahash, Mpumalanga fruit belt, where all of our, all the liquid fruit, all the Ceres juices come from there. The mango, the lychees, the oranges, they all come from that belt. So Gazankulu Bantustan, as it was at the time, is smack bang in the middle of what you can call a fruit cluster. So we partnered with a local juice pulper. We approached several who didn't want to speak to us. We partnered with a local juice pulper who had spare freezer capacity. And he was willing to freeze 10 tons of marula juice on spec at no cost. On that basis, Ceres was willing to go into product development, on the basis that there was 10 tons of juice for their use only if they decided to go into. That was only possible because this guy agreed to do this for free. He had spare freezer capacity. The product development process took 3 years with Ceres. The product development process for the oil took 6 years. Who has that holding power? Who can do that? Poor communities can't do that. We were lucky. We managed to mobilize capital. It was NUM. It was, we managed to form partnerships. But as a general rule, the problem is that poor communities usually don't have that holding power. And so they can't innovate. They can't capture the gains from commercialization of indigenous resources because they end up selling the IP to stay alive. That's what happens time and time again. And it ended up happening in this program too. Because the donors said we were distorting markets by using donor funds to capitalize this business, and they pulled the plug on the funding. So we ended up selling the IP to keep the business alive. That's what happened. So, inequality will get you in the end. Everything in this story, in the end, has been about the unequal playing field, the unequal power, the unequal access to capital, to resources, to market, and at every stage we did get better, we did do better, but at every stage we were stymied by inequality. And so this left me, to get personal, rather distressed. And asking the question, because at the time the discourse was something called making markets work for the poor. I was always a bit cynical about that concept, but But what the question that it begs is, can markets ever actually work for the poor, or even just work better for the poor? Or is the process always, inexorably, one of making the poor work for markets? And that's what I ended up having to confront. Yeah, I'd invested 14 years of my life trying to make all of this work. And time again, despite our best efforts, inequality always got us in the end. And there was no systemic change, and the livelihoods were pitiful. And yet this was being sold as the strategy for ending poverty and creating employment. So, lots of soul searching. And my conclusions, this is my second last slide. My conclusions. Yes, actually, in enterprise development, there really is a risk that all you're doing is making the poor work for markets. It's a real risk. And many programs are doing just that. Yes, it does matter to optimize the scope for employment creation from self-employment and from small businesses. And yes, there are opportunities for meaningful enterprise development, for job creation on decent terms. And some of the lessons on strategy for doing so are in the book. But don't let's fool ourselves. Because at the same time, the narrative that expects the solution to unemployment to come from poor people self-employing their way out of poverty with a microloan on commercial interest rates is deeply misleading, if not actually cynical. The structural constraints are too significant for this to act as a significant pathway out of poverty at scale or with the level of returns required. It's a policy pipe dream. It places the onus of ending poverty on the poor. It leaves current structures of accumulation intact, and it risks our complicity in simply making the poor work for markets. It's an abdication to the primacy of markets in determining social outcomes. What the final chapter of the book is about, advertising, what the final chapter of the book is about is this notion of markets as social constructs. We treat markets as this negative externality. There's nothing external about them. They are formed by societies. They are social constructs. How can we construct them differently? That's a question I don't have answers to yet, but it's a question that we should be asking. How do we construct markets differently to have different distributional outcomes? Oh, that's interesting. This isn't the version that had my final. But anyway, so the final take-home is that employment matters too much to leave to markets alone. And that's why when I ended this work, after several years of reflection, what I did end up doing was initiating and designing a community work program, which does currently employ 250,000 people. It has many problems, pity about the corruption in Copter. However, it does employ 250,000 people, and I ended up moving from a focus on enterprise development to a focus on public employment, on the basis that employment matters too much to societies and to communities to leave to markets alone. It's not Plan A. Plan A is that the economy absorbs everybody on decent terms. But when Plan A isn't working, my God, societies need a Plan B. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Okay, we're going to first start with the raffle. If I can ask you to choose
Power! Is that one?
I think so. Let me see.
I'll be happy if it
Moyo?
And
Luca. You didn't get this time, sorry. She always wins the
I'm
ball.
so processed.
I'm told there are copies in the resource.
Okay, should we take a round of questions? Be cool. Can I have another one? Okay, let's start with those two to warm up.
My question, it revolves around that argument you built on degeneration theory. And
Oh my God, you actually read the book.
yeah, it's kind of based on my thesis this year. But there's two things that I go about that thing. There's an entertainment of economic viability to get these co-ops to have decent wages and pay people and be more sustainable over a period of time. But even your title of the book, for me, it seems like the problem is political viability, and by that I mean this notion of connecting your notion that there's monopoly capitalism. And then you offer these examples towards the end that what's the alternative? We should find products that are not in the market or external markets. And for me that seems to be retreating because I kind of focus on worker co-ops particularly and linking that to the labor movement based on how, even in South Africa, the ones that you studied evolved. So with that in notion, and then through the transition, you see this notion of cooperative movement dying out, and then what Ramaphosa, they get involved in ANC and everybody doesn't care, and then you leave as well. Nobody cares about cooperatives.
Is that another 8 years?
Yeah, so for me, it seems that what my notion is, I have this idea of worker takeovers, like factory takeovers or farm takeovers. That the notion is, it shouldn't be that we should retreat and find other niche markets because we still leave the monopoly capital still there. And that for me seems to be the problem. Because we're speaking of distribution. If these monopolies still have the co-economy, then these alternatives we seem to be playing on the ends rather than focusing on the actual piece of the work, which is to eliminate the monopolies, somehow get what the monopolies own to be the people who actually work those monopolies. But I'm not saying this is a simple issue that can be done over time, particularly given the fact that the labor movement is also disintegrated as well. So that is my notion. I think there's towards the end of your argument on the degeneration theory, you seem to sort of agree with what cooperatives like Mondragon did, that they are not necessarily being degenerative, they're sort of dealing with capitalism. But I don't think that we should consider cooperatives like Mondragon as cooperatives anymore. Because for me, like I said, this notion of, I think economic viability is the lower end. After you pass that, you grow and you grow like Mondragon, you're going to have to deal with political viability, which means you're going to have to assimilate into capitalism really. So when Mondragon is going out and buying out all these other factories, for me that is the antithesis of the very cooperative notion, because now you have these core workers who have the benefits of the surplus value for the other workers who are not part of the cooperative in a sense. How is this Mondragon different, to a traditional capitalist firm? Because for me it seems like, it's almost like if you think of everybody in this room as maybe you are the CEO and everybody works for you. You just tell everybody else, okay, from now on we're going to distribute the means of all this company together. And everybody else, as the company grows, we hire them as normal workers. How is different? Now it becomes the core workers become the ones that are exploiting everybody else who are outside. But although Mondragon does survive.
Should we take the second question and you can answer?
I'm not going to remember all that. Do I have another 40 minutes? My first response is, I'm so excited that you're arguing with me and that you've actually engaged with the ideas, because a lot of that detailed stuff about the co-ops, a lot of people are not interested, but I did spend 8 years grappling with this stuff, and the purpose was to make them work. I didn't start off working in co-ops with the intention of concluding that this is not a good strategy. So for me, it was a really difficult process of engagement with that reality. Just a couple of things, and I won't do half an hour, but firstly, cut me some slack and read till the end of the book. Because the point is that we started with co-ops, and then there were problems. So we tried something else, and then there were problems. So we tried something else. Maybe I was slow, but then the conclusion was, the problem is the structure of the economy. The problem is the nature of markets. The problem, I had, it's not like I didn't start off with a critique. But I do think that the conclusion of the book is that trying to make the poor work for markets is not working. It's not a good strategy, whether you do it through co-ops or other forms of enterprise support. The whole issue with co-ops is they are such a... That's why I try to emphasize the different types of co-ops. Because really, worker co-ops are recognized the world over as the most difficult form of co-op. And I do feel that in South Africa, sometimes we can't resist doing the hardest thing first. And so we're trying to build socialism with worker co-ops, and there are like 10 of them, and they're all failing, and we're still trying, and it takes 8 years, and then, we can't change the world that way. So that's where the critique of project approaches comes in for me. Nothing would please me more than for you to crack a model through which worker co-ops can survive both economically and politically, because they have to do both. Okay, so it would be fantastic if we could build a proper movement of worker co-ops. The problem is, though, that it is a project-level approach, and what we do actually need is systemic level changes. Changes in the nature of the structure of the economy, changes in how we govern markets. Instead of letting markets govern us, how are we governing markets? How are we shaping markets to achieve different distributional outcomes? And I don't have the answers to that question, but that's the question. And I do think that a focus at the project level distracts from those questions. And in a context in which, even at the project level, we haven't had a lot of success, for me, the issue was, where's the systemic change? In terms of your other dimension of your thing, which is about the kind of compromised space, that is the nature of co-ops. They're competing in markets. There is no escape from that. The Soviet Union clamped down on co-ops because they said they were a capitalist form of organization. In capitalism, we hold them up as a socialist form of organization, but they were actually banned in the Soviet Union at some point because they were considered, because they are enterprises competing in markets. So they have a collective character internally, but in their facing the world, they are competing to sell. And we had the situation where we had a co-op printing t-shirts in Num and a co-op printing t-shirts in Numsa, and they were in flat-out war with each other, competing for markets, undercutting each other. It was so that's not a model for transforming the economy. So, I ended up with a lot of dilemmas, and so I'm not going to pretend that I had all the answers, but I hope I've partly responded to your issues.
Yeah, thanks for the presentation. It was great, as always. Some received my question. I haven't read the book yet, so let me know if I just need to read the book. I started thinking about this in the middle of your presentation, and then it really sort of made some of the comparisons when you got to the story about the marula oil. And I started thinking back to those late 90s, early 2000 studies on shea butter in West Africa, which then inspired 1,000 value chain studies. And I couldn't help but think that the conclusions out of that sort of literature and where you ended up were quite different. I'm sure there are some critical pieces on the whole value chain approach and the quite linear sort of story about just moving one further step up the value chain. But I wonder if we could agree that literature is very optimistic about a marula oil type story. I wonder what you see as the differences are. So the two that came to mind were perhaps they were not acknowledging, as you did, the sort of fortune of donor funds and the timing of outside interventions, which aren't things that are systemic. If they downplayed that. And the second possibility is there something about our unique level of concentration in South Africa, which West African countries, is there a bit more scope in other places? I mean, so just the real contrast between the shea butter and that. And then if I could just add a second part to the question. I mean, like you, I've become very despondent about the job summit. Today there's a township economy summit being held in Tembisa. I don't think we even need to be there to know what they're discussing and what the parameters of that are. At the job summit, anything structural was actually met with hostility. It wasn't that's pessimism, that's idealism. This isn't the space for that. So is there a point in, because this seems to be growing in the policy space, is there a point in engaging? And you spent time at TIPS as well, so you might have some insight on that.
Okay, difficult questions. I will confess to having been so deeply dug into my own marula hole that I may not be as on top of the shea butter discourse as I should be. But I do think a very interesting question for that is your last one, which is the relatively unusual South African context. Does it make all this more pessimistic? Because there's no doubt in my mind that, I mean, in India, for example, people do make and sell homemade soap at the village level. I mean, they earn peanuts too, but you know, there is the penetration of big capital is just not the same. There are more spaces for the local production, local consumption model. And the reason that it exists in development theory is that many countries think it works, no? And so we try to apply it here without understanding quite how different the context was. So I think a very interesting developmental question would be to really look at, is it particularly awful for us because of the particular structure of our economy, which is not replicated almost anywhere else in Africa, for example. Does that make a difference to the opportunities for enterprise? I think also, and it kind of links back to your critique, in a sense, of my selloutness, which I completely accept and absorb, because this is the dilemma for development practitioners, is that you are working in the present. So, even in a context where you are critiquing the structure of the economy, that ain't changing in the next decade. Can't see it happening. So do you then wash your hands of looking for applied solutions that can work in the current context? The minute you're doing that, you are in markets. And you better take them seriously. Because you will succeed or fail by how you manage to play that game. And it's a real dilemma for development practitioners. Is sometimes you just have to say, this is what is, what can we do with what is? And if we're improving livelihoods, but they're still horrible, is that worth doing? It's a genuine soul search question. I don't have the answer to it. I've never managed to answer it for myself. I vacillate between, theory and practice, and try to make the one inform the other. And maybe that's part of the answer on the shea butter thing as well, which is that maybe they were overly optimistic, but I'm still proud of the marula. It was 4,000 livelihoods. It was 42 villages. All kinds of good things came out of it. I was pissed off as hell when the donors pulled the plug. I'd do it again. So I can't blame the shea butter people for grasping what came their way and turning that into something that might have had effects in the short term but was not sustainable. I'm not being coherent. But this is the dilemma of development. This is the dilemma of praxis, is that it is not a perfect world.
Yes, thanks, Dr. Phillips. This is just a comment. Because I think even if you compare whether it's West Africa or Asia, wherever you go, different supply chains are very unequal. the relationships are very asymmetrical, you know.
Yes.
And producers at the bottom always basically get little to nothing, you see. And I think we need to understand that at each level of the chain, it's monopolized by big business. Whether you go to transport, there's big business. Whether you go to the harbors, there's big business. So literally at the bottom, it's producers who are literally working to survive, basically.
No, sorry.
No, you can.
No, but you see, but the optimist in me, the optimist in me says, okay, but look at something like Marula. It had never been commercialized before. That value chain was built from the bottom up. That should create a different set of opportunities from a situation where you are incorporated into a value chain as a beggar from below, on the basis of goodwill and corporate social investment. We had something with the Marula oil and with the juice that bigger companies wanted. What we didn't have was a staying power. It needed 10 years to consolidate, and who knows where that might have ended up. But what ended up happening is donors pulled the plug to keep the business alive. And I wasn't there at the time anymore, but they sold the IP. Once you've sold the IP, you've lost huge value. But for me, part of the question is, are there ways we can identify indigenous resources and commercialize them on different terms? Shape those markets on different terms. It would take political will and goodwill capital and all kinds of... But there are a lot of indigenous resources all over the developing world where there is potential, cosmetic, pharmaceutical, and whatever. And we don't have the systems and mechanisms to develop those value chains from below.
Yeah, and that's what I was basically saying, because that sounds like a good story, but then it sort of ends with they took the IP.
Yeah.
Which basically means that, that's the true outcome.
Yeah. Which is why I end up on the last two sides.
Yes. And I guess what I'm trying to get to is that markets are very hostile towards small businesses. I was interviewing farmers now in the Western Cape, and basically there are mega corporations. One, like the Tutoits, mega farm, they own 14 farms. And they were saying there's no room for small-scale farmers in that situation. Small-scale farmers survive by entering, as you said, into co-ops, and even that is quite difficult. So I'm understanding that the markets have become so monopolized that it's very difficult for small businesses to survive, and when they do, they survive on the margins. And I think our thinking, in terms of the government, has to be, understanding these markets and finding a way to build our own capacity in terms of infrastructure and all of that. And I think that's where our government is failing, because they're just creating policies that facilitate monopolies instead of actually finding and building the capacity and helping our people. Because, as you said, there's a lot of indigenous products, but as long as we don't have that capacity, look at what happened with the Soweto. They're like, oh, you're going to Soweto, be wonderful, then boom, Heineken takes it. You see? So that's what I'm saying. Our government, I think, is in bed basically with the corporations, because instead of trying to find models that can compete with monopoly capital, they're basically facilitating that expansion, and I think they're comfortable with having shares in that situation. And that's where I think markets are very unkind to small-scale businesses. Because in West Africa, whether it's coffee or whatever, it always ends up at the bottom. Workers never get anything, or your small-scale farmers always receive peanuts.
And that's why the question I want to leave you with, which is the question that I only learned to ask and not to answer, is markets are not something that are outside of society. The rules that govern markets are social constructs. We allow this to happen. What does it mean that markets are social constructs? How might we construct them differently? The state has a big role, but not just the state. I want to go back to the consumer class and the market power that they built from consumers to change, what was sold and what are the forms of power in society to change the terms on which markets operate and to whom they benefit? I mean, the scenario that you're explaining with the big farmers and the small farmers and whatever, what social interventions would change that? What social interventions, governance interventions, rules of the game would make that scenario different? And how do we get there? That's a big question. So until we answer that question, we're going to be supporting people into a value chain there.
I think building capacity. I think we need to look at Asia, you see, because there are countries that have actually gone up the chain and are competing globally. But I think, as I said, our state is basically sleeping when it comes to the economic game. We're very interested in just political game. But in terms of understanding the trading relationship, understanding the rules of the game, and as I said, building capacity. And that's where education also comes into play. By educating our people and also, that's why I said education and capital. You know?
Okay, we've got one more question here. Is there anyone else? Okay, one more question.
I don't know if it's the question, but okay, people want to live now and people want to eat now, and then it seems your ideas are going to take a long time. I'm not against it.
Hey, I'm damned if I do, damned if I don't.
So, I mean, like MDA,
yeah.
It started because mine workers or other workers, because I'm sure NAM does not only represent other workers as well. Workers were retrenched, and the reason is because the boss is not making more money. So how about workers starting the co-op within the factories, taking over the factories? And have NAM or some trade union thought of coming up with something like that?
I do agree with you, actually. I think that it's one of the things that has not been done in South Africa. But co-ops are for poor people with no money. BEE deals and share ownership schemes and big mercs are what happen when you transform big companies. And there is never a discussion about worker ownership or forms of worker control. I mean, there have been some interesting experiments with ESOPs, employee share ownership programs, and employee share ownership schemes. But there has been no serious attempt in South Africa to convert a functioning, viable economic entity into a worker controlled entity. And I don't understand why. And I agree that that needs to happen. In South Africa, co-ops are the strategy for the most marginalized. And they're the least likely to be able to make them work.
So one question for me is related in the sense that you speak about the different forms of co-ops, and the one is the user co-ops. And coming back to the power of the unions instead of the state, can unions not shape significantly through, instead of investment arms and all that stuff, but through their own, even just as consumers, even not even as producers, shape the market?
They can and they should. They can and they should. And I proposed that to them in 1992, that NUM should support a consumer co-op built from its members, because it would have been the biggest, quickest way of getting a nationwide, sub-regional consumer co-op and using consumer power to shape markets and to influence market outcomes. There was no interest. And the point is that, and this is the thing, is that there is this idea of co-ops that focuses only on worker control. Yeah. So the unions were only interested, and you must watch for this, the unions were only interested in worker control. And that is the hardest, that has limits. It can have important lessons, but it has limits. And we have never, as South Africa, seriously gone, I mean, it breaks my heart that 94 was the perfect moment to introduce consumer co-ops into townships, because businesses had been disallowed there. The big retail outlets had not yet set up their pick and pays and their what's in townships. You had all that UDF mobilization, you had all those small groups, the user groups, women's groups, student groups, everybody could have been mobilized around economic cooperation. To me, the critical term is not actually co-ops. We actually need to build economic cooperation in every facet at every level and build economies of scale that are economies of purpose. And it breaks my heart that we don't have consumer co-ops, but I don't know if we can do it now because it would be war with the spazes. So spazes are now endemic.
Yeah.
There's a spaza on every corner. If you try to set up a consumer co-op now, you would be going to war with the spazes. But that didn't exist in '94. So we missed that opportunity. We missed that moment. I'm not sure if it can work now.
Well, thank you very much. Are there any other questions? I think we should end there. Any burning?
Well, I can't believe you all lasted so long. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thanks.